Well, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and just a couple of verses 24 through to verse 27 that I want us to look at this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I'm going to read from verse 19 just to get something of the context of what Paul is saying here. So from verse 19, Paul says, "Although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may by every possible means save some. Now I do this, all of this, because of the gospel, so that I may share in the blessing. Don't you know that the runners in a stadium all race, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way to win the prize. Now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. So I do not run like one who runs aimlessly, or box like one beating the air. Instead, I discipline my body and bring it under strict control, so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified. In other words, that I myself will share in this gospel, in the blessing of the gospel, as he said in verse 23. Well, as we stand on the doorstep of 2024, we're standing on the doorstep of a year which is an Olympic year. In July, the Summer Olympics will be taking place in Paris. And it's interesting, isn't it, that it was 100 years ago that the Paris Olympics were held in 1924. And arguably, we could say that those 1924 Olympics in Paris were probably amongst the most famous of the modern Olympics, or the Olympics of the modern era. You could argue that because perhaps you would say, well, 1936 might have been more famous because of Nazi Germany, the Olympics held in Berlin, and the whole issue that went around Hitler and Jesse Owens and that. You might say, well, that's a very famous Olympics. You might say that the 1972 Olympics in Munich were more famous because of the attack on the Olympic Village by the Palestinian revolutionary Black September group, they called themselves, where they killed 2 of the Israeli athletes and took 9 of them hostage. And you might say, well, those are famous and very famous Olympics of the modern era. But those are infamous in many ways, whereas the 1924 Paris Olympics were famous mainly because of the exploits of Eric Liddell. You might remember the story made famous in the movie Chariots of Fire, where Eric Liddell, who was the Scotsman, the Flying Scot as they called him, played on the wing for Scotland in rugby. He was a 100-meter specialist. That was his chief event. Fast as anything, over 100 meters. Was not very great at the longer distances, but 100 meter, that was his speciality. And he really was tipped to be winning the 100 meter final at the Paris Olympics in 1924. But in the January, unlike in the movie they depict that he gets the news that the final is going to be held while he's on his way to Paris. Well, actually, he got news of the program in the January and saw that the final for the 100 meter was going to be held on a Sunday. And as a Christian, his convictions were that he would not participate in sport on the Lord's Day. And so he forsook entering this race, which he really was almost a dead cert to win, and he ran instead in the 200 meter and the 400 meter. And the 400 meter was an event which he was not particularly good at, but he started his training in the January to see what he could do, and ended up winning the gold medal for the 400 meter in Paris. Famously, a famous victory. He drew the outside lane, which meant that he was starting with all his competitors behind him, and he couldn't see them. And he had a particular style of running where he'd throw his head back and his arms would go all over the place. And they laughed at him the way he ran, but he was very fast. And so he said that the only thing he could do, because he couldn't see where anybody else was, the only thing he could do was run that first 200 meters as if it was a 100-meter sprint. Run as hard as what you could. Some of the competitors just said they couldn't believe that he was running the first 200 that fast. Why would anybody run that fast? You can't keep it up. In fact, some of the athletes collapsed trying to keep up with him for that first 200 meters. He finished the first 200 meters in just under what was the world record time for the 200 meters. It was less than a second under the world record for the 200 meters that he got there. And then they thought, well, he's going to stop sometime. He can't carry on like this. But he carried on and went through and won, not only won the event, but actually broke the world record for the 400 meters. When they asked him, what are your tactics for running the 400 meters? He said, well, I run the first 200 meters as fast as what I possibly can. And then the next 200 meters, with God's help, I run even faster. And so it's gone down in history for such a heroic act and such a wonderful stand for his Christian faith. On the day that the 100 meters was being run, Eric Liddell was preaching a sermon at a church in Paris. Well, as 2024 comes around, 100 years later, there are many athletes right now who are busy setting their sights on gold for Paris 2022. And it's vital that you set your sights. You have an aim, you have a goal to do that. They say if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. And so, yes, they've got to aim at doing something. And my question for us this morning is this: what are we aiming at in 2024? And will we be successful in what we are aiming at in 2024? Let me give you a definition of success. People have tried to define success in so many ways, and often we get the wrong idea of what success is. I think the best definition that I've come across of success is this, is that it is the ongoing achievement of worthy goals. In other words, if I just do something great and I just do it once and that sort of thing, I can't really say that's a great success. We've had over the years many wonderful one-hit wonders, groups or singers or whatever, who have come out and they brought out one wonderful hit and boom, you never hear of them again. You cannot really say that was success. It's got to be the ongoing achievement. But it's also got to be the ongoing achievement of worthy goals. You can have achieved the distinction of being the world champion toenail clipper. You could clip your toenails so that the toenails fly and get into a little bucket somewhere and that sort of thing. And you might achieve that over and over again. Well, I don't think anybody really cares two hoots about that, and I don't think we'd count that as a success. It's got to be of worthy goals. And so what I want us to do as we look at 2024, I want us to aim for success in 2024 at a worthy goal. Oh, there it is. And so what I want us to do is I want us to aim at better than gold in 2024. I want us to aim at achieving success at something that far outstrips the winning of a gold medal at the Paris Olympics in 2024. I want us to go for what Paul is speaking of here, an imperishable crown. He says, everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. That ought to be our aim in 2024, going for better than gold in 2024. That's what Paul wanted for the Corinthians, and so he encourages them to this goal in three ways. Firstly, he gives them a picture to see. He paints a picture for them. They say that a good illustration is of great value. In preaching class, they tell you that an illustration is like a window that shines light into an otherwise dark room, so that those who are within can see the light and they can see what's in the room and they can understand what's there. It's also like a shop window through which you can look and see what's on display in there as you go around window shopping. You can get a feel, you can get an understanding of what is on offer. And a good illustration is just like that. Jesus uses illustrations all the time in his preaching and his teaching. He refers to the birds of the air. And he refers to the lilies of the field. He uses the illustration of the fields being white unto harvest. Wonderful illustrations that his hearers could understand, they could identify with, and they could appropriate it to what he was teaching. And Paul likewise is no stranger to using good illustrations. In fact, he has three favorites that he uses repeatedly. He uses agricultural illustrations. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. He uses military illustrations. Put on the full armor of God, Ephesians chapter 6. And the third one that he uses often is the one of athletics, as he does so here. Now, why he uses the athletic one at this point in time, I'm not 100% sure, but I can certainly say this. He does it because the Corinthians, as Greeks, would have been people that were besotted with sport. In fact, it may well have been a great games year when he wrote this letter to them. You see, in Corinth, not only did they have the Olympic Games that they sent their athletes to, but in Corinth there was also the year before the Olympics and the year after the Olympics, they would hold the Isthmian Games. Get my word around that. Isthmian Games on the Isthmus of Corinth. And so a year before the Olympics and a year after that, those would be held. And they were famous games. They were held from the 6th century BC all the way through to the 4th century AD. And those games were key to the culture of Corinth. One of the satirical poets said this. He said, "The masses demand two things from the political establishment: bread and games, or bread and circuses. That's all we want. You want to keep the people happy? Give them food and give them sport. That's what will make the people happy." He went on to say, "By day they stood around idle, and in the evenings they watched sport." I think that sounds pretty idyllic to many Brits, doesn't it? But that was their life. They centered around the sport. So it may well have been a year in which either the Isthmian Games were being held or the Olympic Games were being held. And so Paul uses this illustration. And in using this illustration, what he does is he drives home three truths. Firstly, he drives home the truth that there are winners and there are losers. Look at verse 24. He says, don't you know that the runners in a stadium or the runners in a race all race, but only one receives the prize? There are winners and there are losers. Not everyone can be the winner. Not in the games, not in the Olympics, not in life. When the Olympics is taking place in Paris, not everybody is going to win gold. Not everybody is going to win silver or bronze. There are going to be those who are going to be losers. We live in a world where people try to avoid that kind of thinking. They try to make everybody winners. You send your children to nursery and end of the year comes and it's time for prize giving, and they will find prizes for all kinds of things so that everybody gets a prize. In some countries, the education systems have slipped so badly, they've got a policy of pass one, pass all. So you don't fail anybody, everybody just passes. And they all come out at the end of the day with a qualification that means nothing. Well, not all of them. Some of them come out with a qualification that means something, but many of them come out with a qualification that means nothing. So there are winners and there are losers in life. We live in a world, we live in a life, we live in a situation where we will win at some things, we will lose at other things. Second point that Paul is making is that winning requires effort. It requires training. It requires discipline. Look at verse 25. Not everyone who competes, now everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They exercise self-control in everything. He goes on to describe something of that, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So you've got to have a goal, and you've got to be aiming for that goal, and you've got to be working towards that goal if you want to win. If you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. If you aim at nothing, you're not going to win the prize. You can't suddenly show up for the marathon on the day of the marathon and say, this is a good idea, I think I'll compete in this marathon. And now, off you run. You won't get very far at all in doing that. I, in South Africa, swam for many, many years in a row. I swam in an open water swim. It's the largest open water swim in the world. There's close on 16,000 people who compete in that swim each year, and it's a mile across a large dam. And many people think, oh, it's just a mile, get in and swim that. It's a whole different ball game swimming in an open water, muddy water, 16,000 people around you. Getting across to the other side is quite a challenge. And unless you've trained, you're going to have serious trouble. And many times there have been drownings in that race because people have gone in, their companies have said, oh, let's enter a company team and, we'll build up spirit, esprit de corps. And what happens is some of these guys arrive there, they're not fit enough, and they think they're going to get into training by drinking their Red Bulls. And they pile down the Red Bulls before the race, and they find that Red Bulls doesn't give them wings, it doesn't even give them water wings. And they end up going to the bottom. It's a sad situation. So winning requires effort. Gary Player was told, they often used to, I don't even remember Gary Player, he was probably one of the finest golfers in the history of the sport, but Gary Player often had the challenge put before him. They said, oh, he's a lucky golfer, he's just lucky. And Gary Player said this, he said, what I have found is this: the more I practice, the luckier I get. Winning takes effort, it takes training, it takes discipline. Third point that Paul makes is that the value of winning depends on the value of the prize. So he says in the second part of verse 25, he says, they do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. You see, you could win the world championship at toenail clipping. But who cares? What's the value of that? What kind of prize will you win for that? It doesn't matter if you have won the first prize in a nonsense event or competition. But if you win first prize in a valuable competition, it makes all the difference. If you win the 100-meter race at your primary school for grade ones, it means nothing compared to the person who wins the 100-meter in Paris in 2024. The value of the prize has to be worthwhile. So success is the setting of and attaining of worthy goals. Paul elsewhere says to Timothy, he says this, he says, "For the training of the body has limited benefit, but godliness is beneficial in every way, since it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come." You see, I can go into training and do all kinds of wonderful exercises, and I can win the Mr. Universe competition. But the day that I die, that means absolutely nothing. I might have had a beautiful body, but if I don't have a beautiful soul, made beautiful by God, it all means absolutely nothing. And that's what Paul is saying to them. He's saying to them, you need to run a race that has a prize that is far better than anything that this world can offer. So in the second place, he shows them a picture to see. In the second place, he tells them about a prize to be won. And so we see in that second part of verse 25, they do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. What Paul is doing here is he's using what is called an a fortiori argument, or an a fortiori argument, where you argue from the lesser to the greater. So if this is true in this little thing, how much more is that true? Jesus uses that when he says, sparrows, they're 2 a penny, but not one of them falls to the ground without your Father knowing it. And you are far more valuable than many sparrows, and the very hairs on your head are numbered. So why should you worry? If that's true, how God cares for the sparrows, then it's certainly true that he's caring for you, whose very hairs on your head are numbered. And so Paul uses this argument in this way, and he says the runners in the stadium, they do that running. They run in a way such as to win the race. They go into the strict training. They exercise the self-control in everything. They do all of that to win the prize. And the prize that they're going to win is a perishable crown. It's a crown that's not going to last. The crown that he is referring to there, the perishable crown, the crown that they would have won in those days, would probably have been a laurel wreath, or a wreath made out of the boughs and the twigs and the leaves of either a bay tree, a laurel tree, or maybe an olive tree. And so you would make that. And you get that, and it's all wonderful, and you go and put it in a prized place. And what's going to happen? Within a week or two, the leaves start drying, and the twigs start getting brittle, and then the leaves drop off, and you're starting to get into trouble with your wife because she's having to pick up these leaves all the time. It doesn't take too long before you're taking that wreath and you're throwing it away, because all it's doing is collecting dust and dirt. And Paul says they're doing this. They go into all this effort to win this prize, and it's going to actually perish. Let me ask you, who of you knows the name of the athlete that won the 100 meters of the Isthmian Games in the year 64? None of us. What value was it? You see? of nothing. But who won the prize of the upward call when he died? The Apostle Paul. Do we remember him? Yes, we remember him. You see, that's what Paul is getting at here. And I want to put it to you that when the athletes, when it's all done and dusted and all the gold medals have been handed out in Paris, I want to tell you, all those gold medals worth a lot of money. The day is coming, there is a day coming, when those gold medals, all of them, throughout the history of the Olympics, can be all loaded into one barrel and put together. They will all add up to nothing. Their value will be nothing. Because on that day, you're not going to get to glory and say, well, here's my gold medal for the 2024 Paris Olympics. It means absolutely nothing in God's sight. It can be nothing. The crown jewels, the crown that the sovereign wears, one day is going to be worth absolutely nothing. Whoever the reigning sovereign might be on that day when the Lord appears, when the trumpet sounds and the heavens are rolled back like a scroll, and those who are dead in the Lord descend with him, and the graves are opened, and they receive they're reunited with their bodies, and those Christians that are alive will rise as well, be changed in the twinkling of an eye, and will rise to meet him. I want to tell you right now, whoever the reigning sovereign is, I've got a word of advice for him or her. Don't run back and quickly grab your crown and put it on and go and think that's going to get you anywhere. It's going to be absolutely useless. How many sports stars are there who make a fortune in this life? And these days they can make massive fortunes. And so many of them end up losing it all when their careers end because they don't know how to manage the money. And they lose the whole lot. But even those who do manage to keep it, on the day that he comes or calls, of what value is it? How much do you think Bobby Charlton left when he died? I know exactly how much he left when he died. Everything. Couldn't take any of it with him. Beloved, that's what Paul is saying. They run and they go into all this effort, and that's great. And yes, physical exercise, as he says to Timothy, is of some value. So don't decry it, but don't make that your number one goal. You need to have a far better goal. Here, I want you to go for better than gold in 2024. I want all of us to go for better than gold in 2024. And so Paul exhorts them. He says to them, so run in such a way as to win the prize. And the prize that I want you to win is the prize of an imperishable crown. We do, it says Paul, to win an imperishable crown. A crown which is described in the scriptures as a crown of glory. Think about this crown compared to the crown in the crown jewels. Think of this crown. This is a crown of glory. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 4. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. It is a crown of righteousness. 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 8. There is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. Let me just say this. If you go back to this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul says, run in such a way as to win the prize. In the Greek, it really says that you are to win the prize from the umpire, win the prize from the judge. And that's what he's saying. We're going to win the prize from the judge, because it was always the judge in the race, the umpire who would give out the prizes. In the same way, when we get to glory, it's going to be the judge who will give out the prizes. And what does Paul say? He says, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. Here's the good news. I said earlier that there's only one winner. Well, in this race and the prize that we go for, beloved, there are many winners. In fact, all those who are in Christ Jesus receive that crown. And so what a wonderful, we're not competing with one another. We are there as comrades, helping one another to go and to get that crown. So it's a crown of glory, it's a crown of righteousness. James says it's a crown of life. Blessed is the one who endures trials, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. In Revelation 2 and verse 10, be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life, says the Lord Jesus Christ. What a wonderful prize to go for, better than gold in 2024. And it's imperishable. That crown is indestructible. That crown is untarnishable. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. Don't store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves don't break in and steal. It's imperishable, it's indestructible, it's untarnishable, because it has been won for us by Christ himself. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, because of his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Christ Jesus from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you. Beloved, I want to tell you, whatever you aim at for 2024, whatever else you aim at for 2024, aim at this. Because if you don't aim at this and you don't attain this, let me tell you, it is all of no value whatsoever. And so then, beloved, Paul gives us a program that needs to be followed. That's the third thing that he does. He says, run in such a way as to win the prize. How do you run in such a way as to win the prize? Well, the writer to the Hebrews tells us. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a large crowd of witnesses, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith. For the joy that lay before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He's sitting in the judge's seat, waiting to give the prize to those who run the race correctly, keeping their eyes not on themselves, keeping their eyes not on their own ability, but keeping their eyes on him. Their responsibility is to throw off, lay aside every hindrance that so easily ensnares, and they are to run that race with endurance. Keep on running. Beloved, as we run, Paul says this, he says, you are to run it the way that the writer to the Hebrews says, but it happens, doesn't just happen. You don't just get to the starting line and say, okay, this is it, now I'm going to run. Way before you get to that starting line, you need to have gone into the training. So Paul says, I do it in a way that is not aimless. Look at what he says. He says, everyone who competes and exercises self-control, they do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. So I do not run like one who runs aimlessly. Paul doesn't just run around in circles. He has an aim in mind, just like Eric Liddell had an aim in mind to be able to win the 400 meters. So we need to have an aim in mind. Just like I used to go into training every year to train for that swim, I had an aim in mind. You don't run aimlessly. Secondly, you don't just do it theoretically. It's not theoretical. Paul says, I don't beat the air. I don't run like one running aimlessly or box like one beating the air. I'm not just shadow boxing. This is not just, muscle memory. Let me get the muscle memory going. Let me do that. No. This is doing the actual thing. I don't. How many people think, I'm going to, my New Year's resolution, I'm going to get fit this year. I'm going to take out a gym subscription and I'm going to get myself into shape. I'm going to pull myself right. And so they pay the gym subscription, they go and buy the bag with the logo on and the t-shirt with the name of the gym emblazoned on it, and they arrive at the gym the first morning and they put it all on, and then they walk around the gym floor talking to everybody who's exercising here, there and everywhere, and then afterwards they go and they have a shower and go home. And then they don't go back to the gym for another 3 weeks. And when they go there in 3 weeks' time, they think that they can do it. No, if you're going to go and get the gym subscription, then get onto the equipment and start doing the work. It's not theoretical. It's not shadow boxing. This is getting in and doing the hard work. And then thirdly, he says it's not careless. You don't do it as if it's just haphazard. He says, instead I discipline my body and bring it under strict control. Now, it's interesting what Paul is saying there when he says, I discipline my body. The translation of that is very hard. Some people say, I beat my body. In fact, a very literal translation, if you're taking it as beating, would say, I actually beat myself under the eye. Because the word actually says something about being under the eye. I believe that the best way to understand the translation of that disciplining my body is Paul is saying, I'm keeping an eye on it. I'm keeping an eye on my body. I'm watching it. When I see it going here, I do this. When I do that, so I'm watching. I'm keeping it under strict control, and I'm keeping an eye on it. I'm disciplining it, and I'm exercising control over this body of mine. I mean, Paul says there a couple of times when he says, those who run in the race, they run in such a way, and when he says, I bring my body under the strict control, he uses the word in the Greek, which is a lovely sounding word, and it's very descriptive, agonizomai. I'm going to agonize in getting myself into shape for this. And so Paul says, I go into strict training. I discipline my body. I bring it under strict control so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Well, what is he talking about, that strict control in terms of spiritual sense? How do you train and exercise spiritual disciplines? What are the things required? You need to read the Word. You need to study the Word. You need to be in prayer before the Lord. You need to be regularly in times of devotion with the Lord. You need to be redeeming the time for worshiping the Lord. You need to be redeeming the time of fellowshipping with His people. All of these things, these are the means of grace. These are the spiritual disciplines. And we as Christians have a responsibility to exercise those spiritual disciplines. And like Gary Player, let me tell you, the more you practice, the luckier you'll get. The more you practice, the more successful you will get. And all of that, says Paul, so that I will not be disqualified. I will not be cast away. Which another way is another way for him to say what he said in verse 23. I do all this because of the gospel, so that I may share in the blessing. And so let me end there. Everything that I've said right now could all simply be chalked up by you, applied by you, as some kind of legalistic works righteousness. Moralistic, I'll do it, I've got to strive harder, I've got to do a good job, and it all becomes you, and it's mere legalism and works-based righteousness. if you take the gospel out of it. And that's why I believe Paul has put the gospel in here. Because what is the gospel? The gospel is this. If you just turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10, the gospel is this: by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Yes, we do all we can. We act as responsible beings. We train ourselves, but we rest completely in the one who has done it all for us. Jesus Christ is the one who won the crown. He gives you the crown. He's the one who won the robes of righteousness. He clothes you in those robes of righteousness. You see, you and I will fail. As we try and as we strive, we will fail repeatedly. And what do you do in that turn? Try harder? Well, if you're trying as hard as you possibly can already, there's nothing you can do. In fact, what you need to do is, yes, cast yourself upon him and keep on exercising those spiritual disciplines. Eric Liddell said this when he got back from the Paris Olympics. He said, "It has been a wonderful experience to compete in the Olympic Games and to bring home a gold medal. But since I have been a young lad, I have had my eyes on a different prize. You see, each one of us is in a greater race than I have run in Paris. And this race ends when God gives the final medal." Here was a man who had his head screwed on correctly. Here was a man who had the right balance in his life. He said this, he said, "Many of us are missing something in life because we are after the second best." He knew that that medal in Paris was second best. He was once asked if he regretted his decision to leave the fame of the athletics track, because a year later he was on the mission field. They said, "Don't you regret having left a really wonderful athletics career and go into this ignominy of the mission field?" And he said this, he said, "It is natural for a chap to think over all that sometimes. But I am glad I am at the work I'm engaged in now. A fellow's life counts for far more at this than any other." Being on the mission field, to him, was of greater value and counted for more than any medals he could win in Paris. And so you and I may not even be able to compete for a gold medal in Paris in 2024. But I want to tell you, we are all competing for the greatest prize of all, the prize of the upward call, where we will all be winners. Let's keep our eyes fixed on him, trusting in him, and let us go for gold. Let us exercise those spiritual disciplines in this year, that we may see him blessing us, that we may grow in the Lord Jesus Christ. May that be our goal, mine and yours, ours corporately for 2024.